Now, debt, of course, is a big meta story ever since the pandemic hit. So let's pull the clock back a little bit to November 2020. At that point in time, Zambia became the first pandemic-era defaulter on the continent when it missed a $42.5 million payment on one of its Eurobonds. Now, in anticipation of a debt crisis, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the G20 Common Framework came up. But the latter, in the IMF's judgment, has faced significant implementation challenges. Here's the view on how things have played out from Zambia's finance minister barely a week ago.
We go to the staff level agreement, but now we need to go to the IMF full program, which will also give us the concession of financing. But we have a problem, as you are aware. We've been waiting for the committees to sit, and while we are here, I hope we can get some clarity from you and the colleagues from the World Bank on how we can move forward, because for now, it is stalled.
So then, why exactly did those two programs not meet their goals? And especially at a time when there are 14 low-income economies here in Africa at high risk of debt distress and another 6 that are already in debt distress. Here's part of my conversation with the director of the Africa Department at the IMF.
Two separate initiatives had different objectives. The DSSI to create a bit of breathing room for countries vis-a-vis official sector obligations. And I think they did do that to some extent for those countries that applied for that. But of course, it only addressed part of the debt service problem, debt service challenge that the countries faced, and it has expired. The common framework is the architecture that was to replace and expand what the DSSI, which was temporary, was always envisaged as a temporary initiative. What was left of the DSSI, what was left unaddressed by the DSSI, if you will. The challenge with the common framework has been that it hasn't been, as countries have applied for this, it hasn't moved as quickly as possible. In terms of providing the kind of debt relief countries needed. So the point we highlight in terms of the common framework is that it needs to be delivering in a time-bound way so that countries begin benefiting from the debt relief that they need. Now, there's been some good news in the context of our spring meetings, as you may have seen. For example, Creditor Committee for Zambia, which is one of the countries that had applied for the common framework, is about to be set up. So that's very good news indeed. And we now look forward to very rapid, very quick treatment of Zambia's debt obligations to the official sector. So discussions could be expanded to the private sector, and the country can benefit from official financing.
From your reading of the room, when you're speaking to creditors to some of these countries that are in distress, Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, and so on, what are the concerns that they had that were essentially holding them back? Because, if we're having this conversation, for example, in the early noughties, it would literally be a case of bilateral creditors, multilateral creditors in one room. Now, though, you have to bring in a lot of the private creditors who hold Eurobonds issued by a lot of these countries. Is the concern from the private creditors that, look, we don't want to take a haircut, the multilateral should take that first, or the bilateral should take that first? What's happening there?
So, indeed, it is the challenge is a coordination problem to significant degree. To be very clear, we now have a much more complex creditor environment, as you're saying, and which is why there is a premium on having coordination mechanisms like the common framework that are going to be agile, nimble, and time-bound to deliver. That's why it's so important, and why we've been investing so much energy on it. Now, transparency around, the kind of debt obligation countries have, all of the work we've been doing to promote that is also very important. So, but the official sector needs to move first the common framework has a very important role to play, and the participation of official creditors is why things have been held up. Now that that's ongoing, we can broaden the discussion to the private sector and other entities. To be very clear, multilaterals are, of course, putting money on the table. The terms of financing that they provide also is, of course, very concessional. So, that's not part of the discussion, but rather kind of, more commercial term credits.
Is the odds of a default, perhaps, or rather the fear of the stigma that comes with a default, is that perhaps being overstated here? And here's why I'm asking that question. Argentina has defaulted on sovereign debt, Eurobonds, several times, but they still came back to the market and they've gotten long-term debt, 50-year debt issued to them several times over. But every single time we have this conversation with policymakers here in Africa, the conversation is, no, we cannot afford to actually default on our debts. Yes, I understand that. But if you don't have fiscal room, your economies have been ravaged by COVID, at some point, you do need to have that conversation about restructuring your debt. So is that fear of stigma around default, or even just having a conversation around restructuring, is that a huge problem that's being overstated?
I think, a couple of points here. Look, one of the things is, there tends to be a broad, generalization about, every African country being in debt difficulty or in debt trouble. So I think, that's some of the things that ministers are wary of, I guess. So there are some countries that are very, very clearly in an unsustainable debt position. I think, once that becomes clear, then action is really, really important. Then there's another set of countries that, where debt vulnerabilities have increased, but should be able to continue servicing debt provided more effort is put into collecting tax revenues. And, they need also to sustain market access and can do so without passing an undue burden of adjustment on their people. So there's that group of countries. And then there's still others where the debt situation is manageable. So it really depends on which category you fall on. All that said, I think, from our side, one thing I can assure you is that, the last thing we want to see is when debt vulnerability is as high as it is, that the burden of adjustment is falling on countries, on people in those countries, rather than on the creditors. And so this is why actually we have very frank, very robust discussion in countries wherever we see debt difficulties, going in a direction of implying too much austerity on people, and ask countries to seek debt restructuring.